really we had a very, very honest discussion around options for if I was to do the treatment in Hong Kong versus overseas. I chose to do it overseas because of a combination of, where am I going to be in a number of years' time, the point that I wanted it to be something that I could do whether I did find someone or didn't find somebody, therefore keeping control over when and how I could use my eggs was quite important. And then also having the support network, that was really the main drivers of choosing London, as well as it being very reputable for this.
Let's talk about eggs, baby. Let's talk about she and he. Let's talk about all the good and bad things on fertility. Let's talk about eggs. Let's talk about eggs.
Hello, welcome to How Would You Like Your Eggs podcast. I'm Dawn Chan, your host, founder of Soul Fertility, a community and platform that empowers women to take ownership of their reproductive timeline. In each episode, we invite guests to share their thoughts on fertility preservation, how they manage their fertility journey, as well as topics related to their choice. Today, we invited Cassie, a friend we met at the Women's Foundation in Hong Kong, to speak a little bit more about her journey in the UK. So Cassie is an industry professional in the strategy and communication sector. She had been advising global businesses and leaders and also been traveling a lot for work. So she recently is seconded to climate projects in Abu Dhabi in UAE, as well as Baku in Azerbaijan. So very excited to be able to catch her today here because she just landed 2 days ago back for a week. And she's going to be off again soon. So very much welcoming you to our podcast.
Thank you so much. Apologies for being so difficult.
No, love to
come in there
have
because I've
you.
been wanting to do this. But thank you so much for setting up and well done on everything so far with it. It's been really exciting to kind of watch how you've turned from just chats in the Landmark Cafe about all of these various experiences right through to what you've created on the website and then this whole experience that you're building. So yeah, it's been really exciting to be part of sitting across lunch tables and now sitting across podcast tables.
And I really remember the first time we talked about this topic was because, obviously both of us are very much about women empowerment and forging our own paths. And that's why we joined the mentorship program at the Women's Foundation. But what really got us going was our disappointments in our own fertility experiences overseas. I did in LA and you actually did in London back in 2022, right? So why don't we start with just a little bit more about that process and how you come about that decision to go overseas to the UK, to London, to freeze your eggs?
Sure. Yes, it's definitely a subject that we've put to rights over the last couple of years. So I think maybe just in terms of how this journey came around and also advice for anyone that's thinking about going through a similar process. I discovered as I started researching the subject that there was essentially three main areas that I had to look at and consider. So the first one being the medical treatment itself. So you have to find out how you where you are, and
how
there's
old
a
you
number
are,
of
basically.
well, age is a big part of it, but people can have fertility challenges, and so one of the first things that I'd encourage anyone to do is to sit down and meet a doctor and just go through some of the basic screenings and fertility checks that anyone can go through. It's very, very simple. It's a few blood tests. It's an ultrasound. And that will help to build up a picture of just how you are, and help to set the first course of any kind of treatment that you're going down. So whether or not you're thinking about doing this or not, it's a really, really good first step because it just helps you to understand how your body are, and then you can inform any decisions from there. So medically, all of a sudden you're trying to get your head around whole new subjects that are quite scientific and lots of words and lingo that I certainly haven't paid attention to in 20 years. So there was all of that piece that you're trying to go through and navigate. The second thing is then working out the medical options and the institutions that you can choose from, clinics here or around the world. There's combinations of public, private care, some considerations. Some people's work have insurance policies and things that cover it. So you're trying to think through the institutions, the right doctors for you, the costs involved, where they are, all sorts of different sort of cost considerations and things, as well as the rules of the place that you're going to, as well as their specialisms and the kinds of treatments that they offer. And then the third piece, which I hadn't really thought about until I was going through the process, is around jurisdiction. And all of a sudden, it's not just a case of what medical treatment do you want and where are you planning to do it. It's thinking through a lot of rules, not just about your eligibility to do the egg freezing itself, but then when you want to use the eggs later on. There's a lot of rules about, where you can transfer them, how you can use them, and here where we live in Hong Kong, unmarried women aren't allowed to fertilize their eggs. So all of a sudden you're having to not just think about the medical choices, but you're also having to imagine yourself and where you're going to be in 3, 5, 7, 10 years time. And thinking about the circumstances and what you need out of different medical care. And a lot of it's not very clear. A lot of it is short articles, somebody's online experience here, websites of clinics offering the services. So it's quite difficult to pick, to build up that independent picture. So, I think congratulations for setting up So, because, it really is filling a gap in something which is so difficult to start navigating, because so much of what you rely on then turns into, the experiences of somebody that you've met or, one good doctor that, helps you sort of on parts of the journey. But it is quite nascent still. It doesn't feel like something that everyone is doing.
So not yet, certainly. So when you talked about, I think, jurisdiction, I think one thing is really related to that is the legal constraints. What you're really talking about is the regulatory restrictions that one would face, whether somebody would face in their wherever they're residing when it comes to picking their own fertility treatment, right? And so when you think about Hong Kong versus, for example, the UK where you eventually picked, the major difference here is that what we just mentioned, single women in Hong Kong cannot fertilize their eggs, whereas in the UK that is not a constraint. That's one key thing for many single women potentially, but also for the LGBTQ community, right? Actually, interestingly, in the UK in 2018, 90% of people going through IVF and sort of IUI treatments are heterosexual couples, but actually also 10% of them are same-sex couples and also even single people who are looking to become parents, right? And so that becomes suddenly an option for people made possible if you do it in the UK versus, for example, in Hong Kong. So that's one of the typical rationales that we hear when we're talking to people about starting to think about if going overseas makes sense for them, because it's not an easy feat. There's so much more planning and logistical things to do, and you really have to do it for a specific reason. And one thing usually is to overcome a legal constraint. I think another one usually is cheaper costs, right? So you'll be looking at, for example, in the UK, I think currently if you're looking at freezing in the private sector, that's probably looking at £4,000 to £6,000. And that's still a lot cheaper, almost 50% cheaper than what you will see for similar services in Hong Kong. Right, and besides just the private sector cost, if you think about the places like Australia, there's also Medicare rebates, so it is possible to get that price even lower. And what I found was really interesting when I was doing my research in London, actually, is that the London Egg Bank offers a freeze and share program. So what you actually do is that if you are at a certain age range and you meet certain health criteria, you can actually freeze for free, and also include 3 years of free storage if you're willing to donate half of the eggs that you retrieved in your cycles. So I think that's super interesting and innovative in a way to help solve some of the financial problems that women are looking at when it comes to looking for fertility treatments and elective egg freezing. And when you're younger, you don't have as much financial ability to afford this option, but you've got, better number or more number of eggs. And so going for this option could be quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think on the finance piece, I think because you're choosing something which is elective, it's really an insurance for a life decision that you want to make available at some point. It doesn't have the same urgency as other sort of immediate bills and things. So it is a bit of a tough pill to swallow when you're when you're sort of thinking through both the physical impact, the financial impact, and then the life impact of having to sort of clear that time and take that time for the treatment as well. So it is quite a big thing to bite off, and I think as you say, for a lot of people, that pressure can be quite prohibitive. It is one of those things that it is recommended to do earlier, but I think people shouldn't be disheartened as well. I mean, I think we do read all the statistics. I think by 35, I've just had my 35th birthday last month. By 35, your chances of natural conception on average have halved. And so it's not just a case of conception, it's also quality of the eggs, which I know that your last podcast really focused on a lot. And so really it's just making sure that if and when you want to have that option available in the future, that you're giving yourself the maximum opportunity. And I think I was taking that decision as a single woman. I know other people, both in relationships, single people who are also doing the same thing. But I think in either camp, it's a decision that's not just for you as an individual. If you are choosing to defer those kinds of decisions, then whether it's with a partner or whether it's with somebody that you may meet down the line, the chances and the deterioration is something that you do have to think about quite seriously. And it might be that by the time you have a second or third child, you could be in your 40s. So I think it's just about extending that opportunity that people have. And it is a difficult one, and I think people need to also factor in that it's unlikely to be just one cycle. You are probably signing a bill for 2, if not 3 cycles. And one of the things we can sort of touch on is why why and what we're aiming for, because I know that part of it was expectation management. That's one of the things that we both really struggled with in terms of understanding what we were aiming for, and then what good was, and what our options and things were as a result. But yeah, I think that's one of the really tricky things going into it. And when you're trying to navigate so many different considerations at the same time, all of a sudden you've gone from never hearing of fertility hospitals, and now you're trying to assess their score on something or other and understand what different packages include. And particularly doing it overseas, you're also just thinking logistically about how you can take that much time out of work, and all of the other considerations that go into doing that as well. So it is quite a big thing to chew off. I don't want to sort of downplay some of the the stuff that goes into that. But certainly, like we've spoken, we know a lot of people who are doing it in different markets. It's definitely for a lot of the people that I know in Hong Kong who are considering it. And as soon as you suddenly start talking about it, people come out of the woodwork. People who are going through IVF, people who are thinking about egg freezing. I've got friends who are looking at Taiwan, as you mentioned, Australia, You did it in LA. I've known other people do it in London. So it's definitely a very international thing. And when I was talking to the clinic in London, they were saying that they're also seeing a lot of demand from people coming back from the UAE, different parts of the Middle East as well. They were speaking a lot about, British people overseas, but also a lot of people coming in as medical tourists, I guess, as well. So yeah, I think it's a growing area. It's just one that all of a sudden you go from knowing nothing about to then finding a whole ecosystem of people. And, I think that's good, because I think it means that it's growing. I think it's getting clearer. I think the support's getting better. And conversations are quite key to us kind of keeping that.
And I like how you mentioned it's maybe the phrase medical tourism, but it's actually not all fun and giggles.
No.
Far from that, right? When we have conversations in Hong Kong even about more closer locations like Thailand, Taiwan, and people are like, oh, it seems like those places are a lot cheaper, and those are amazing tourist places as well. And so it seems quite interesting and almost exotic to do your fertility treatment while being in a vacation location, right?
Yeah.
And I always caution a little bit against that, to not really think of it as a vacation. It is something that you need to schedule for. You need to think about what is your care schedule, if you will. And I think that's something that I don't know whether it was one of your considerations when going back to the UK, to be closer with family, such that you can get the right support going through your fertility journey.
I mean, picking location was an interesting one, because all of a sudden, I guess a bit like any kind of, insurance or those sorts of things, you were thinking in time frames like way bigger than most normal decision making.
Yeah.
So when I was thinking about where I'm likely to be, that going home, UK making sense, my family being there, it's, stabbing yourself in the leg is not, or in the stomach is not fun.
Yeah.
So actually, having the first couple of days of, sitting there with my mum and, her coming like, come on, it's not that bad. See, you're not the one having to stab it.
Yeah.
There is that benefit of, that, and the familiarity with medical systems and those sorts of things. That was a comfort. But I think, it's with a lot of what we're talking about, it's minimizing risk and disruption as well. So one of the things, particularly the doctor was telling me in Hong Kong, is I could do the treatment here, and then at some point in the future I could choose to transfer if I wanted to. But all of those sorts of things do come with risk. And one of the things, and we've had quite long chats about the expectation management side, and what is it that you're aiming for, because there isn't a guide that says this is the perfect number. 20 gets cited quite a lot. I don't know whether there's much of a medical foundation in that, or whether it's just a number that's kind of...
No, it is. It's based on medical research of cohorts of women of different ages, right? And so 20 isn't a magic number for everybody. It is more of a number for 35 and under, where it puts you at 90% of chances of having at least one live birth if you have 20 eggs. But as your age goes down, your curves sort of moves. So 20 becomes insufficient, if you will. Once you turn 36, 37, older, or 40, then your number edges more closer to, for example, 30 or more, in order to get a similar chance of success.
Right.
But I think when you talk about expectation management, I think it's, when it comes to the cross-border piece, it's also quite separated, because you've got the Hong Kong experience where you did your initial checkups, you talked to your doctor, you found somebody that works well, you knew your early numbers, and then once you've decided, I guess midway, that UK makes sense for you, you need to go then pick your medical provider that is going to be located in the UK. And this journey, you're the one who's project managing it, right? You are providing the information you got in Hong Kong to your medical provider in UK. You're doing all the communication, do everything all up front. How did that look like for you?
So starting with what happened in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So Dr. Dorothy, big shout out, she was brilliant, down at the women's clinic in Central. I had a great experience with her. She understood immediately, what I was coming in and asking, and just really talked me through the medical checks that could be done. We ran the tests. I went back in. She explained the number. There was a lovely stamp of like Hong Kong style adequate over the top of the certificate. You're like,
you're
thanks,
adequate fertility.
Yeah, that's charming. And then she sort of said, well, when adjusted for age, this is looking good, and explained the options. And really, we had a very, very honest discussion around options for if I was to do the treatment in Hong Kong versus overseas. I chose to do it overseas because of a combination of where am I going to be in a number of years' time, the point that I wanted it to be something that I could do whether I did find someone or didn't find somebody, therefore keeping control over when and how I could use my eggs was quite important, and then also having the support network, that was really the main drivers of choosing London, as well as it being very reputable for this. So choosing the clinic, there are a number of different options. There is an authority, which you know the name of, and I don't.
Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority in the UK.
Yeah, catchy. And so that's a really useful starting point, because they actually have a register of any of the clinics that you can go to. A couple of just simple, useful functionalities, like you can search by postcode. So that was really useful in seeing where there were clinics that were near to where I could be. And then some research. I was going in as an international private patient, so then having a look at the combination of different clinics and what they're offering. I think we've both sort of complained about, there's very fixed clinic hours, and when you're working and you're trying to fit in calls around schedules and things, trying to like track anyone down by the phone was quite painful, but in the end I chose a hospital called the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital in southwest London. It's an NHS hospital that is a teaching hospital. It has a very good ward there, and they accept private international patients. And for me, I knew the hospital, I sort of knew the area, and it's a very sort of simple, easy commute. And as one of the points that we said, you're in and out of the hospital every 2 or 3 days, so it is important that it's convenient. But also just being, the kind of NHS teaching hospital brand, for me, it just represented something where I wasn't going to get ripped off. It was going to be reputable, it was going to be safe. But one of the things that I really discovered along the way is that it's not set up to offer the same kinds of services for people coming in as an international visitor as if I'd gone for one of the other clinics, like the London Women's Clinic. I think there are a couple that friends have looked at as well, like Lister and a couple of other names over there. But the one thing that made it hard was that I think a lot of people are referred in and therefore maybe going back to a different doctor, whereas I was trying to deal directly with the hospital, and I was on a very, very fixed trip. So I needed to land on this date, start my treatment, wrap it on this date, and then catch a flight back. And that proved to be quite tricky.
I think that was a similar experience I had as well when I was in LA, was you felt you didn't have as much margin of error when it comes to doing an overseas fertility treatment, because you've only budgeted a certain amount of days. It's not like you're going to be in that location for a month, for 2 months, right? You don't really have the luxury of that time. And so you almost wanted everything to work out well, one step after another. And you don't really have a lot of room for error. But these things do come with a lot of surprises, if you will.
No, it's and I think we're both so similar in that regard. Like we needed a really fixed time frame on a natural on a natural body cycle.
Yeah.
And that was when I was talking to the clinic, they would say, oh, it's fine, you just first day of your period, you just give us a call, then and I was quite similar. I was like, no, this is the day that I need to be coming in. And so luckily it did work. It did work to cycle, but there wasn't much margin of error. And one of the implications of that, which I would encourage people to check out, is the first week of the
hormonal stimulation.
Yes, the hormone stimulation. They can give different amounts, and for a lot of young, healthy, women kind of going through it who don't have fertility challenges, they tend to start on the lower end. So the dosage starts from 150 and goes up typically to about 400. And I was started on 150. If I go back and I do the treatment again, which I'm potentially doing this summer, then that would need to be boosted like quite a bit more. And so one of the things that the consultant said, is that if I do that, I won't be safe to fly as quickly. So I will need to extend the length of my trip. So I wish I'd known that, because I don't know how much I could have, negotiated putting that dosage up in the first place. I know that they are very, very mindful of, risks associated with that, and they don't want to, ruin your course. But that's a really real consideration. You aren't giving yourself a lot of, wiggle room when you're doing that. And it also comes down to your company. It is quite disruptive to be going into the hospital every few days. If you are, I think it's one thing if you're doing it at home, then, maybe you'd want to take the first day or so, and you'd certainly need the days off, like around the actual retrieval. But most of the time you could probably balance it if you were sort of, working and sort of doing that. But if you're also trying to factor in being overseas and out of time zone, it's just not possible. I was incredibly lucky that my work were very, very supportive. My bosses, we worked on
the schedule and how that would look like.
And they were great. But I appreciate that not everyone has that experience, and not everyone feels comfortable in sharing it as well. So I think that's one of the tricky things. But if you're there to do the medical treatment, and you feel pretty rough. So
how did your side effects look like?
So I was okay. I think it's.
But it was just disruptive, right? It seems like you didn't have major side effects, but it was just.
No, I think it was. Sorry, I can't remember. Is it on day 5 or 6 where you suddenly start doing the
trigger shot?
Before the trigger shot, the second jab.
Okay.
So you do the first jab for a few days, and then you have a few days where you've got 2 jabs, and then at the end you've got a trigger jab, and then you go in and you do
the antagonist one.
But I think it was the first day of the second one, and I just felt like someone had like shaken up a Coke can and like stitched it inside me. I was so uncomfortable. I just felt like I could explode. I was so uncomfortable. So I remember going into the doctor, and it was one of the days that I was in the clinic, and I was like, please, it can't get any worse, because I was thinking, oh my God, if this gets worse every day. And they said, no, first day it should go down, and it absolutely did. So everyone is slightly different, but they've seen it all. So at least if you do sort of speak up on challenges, then they have seen everyone kind of go through it all. And I thought it was really interesting what your last guest said about no one having needed sort of help. Actually, you can do the injections yourself. If it's a mental hurdle, and I completely agree with that. When you're sat there and you've got a needle and someone's saying it's fine, just put it into your leg, that's really it's horrible. But it is absolutely fine. It is a very, very small needle. It's deeply unpleasant, but it lasts about a minute a day, 2 if you've got to do the couple of injections. But it's really fine. It's just it's a mental hurdle, and it's difficult. The idea of having to go back and do it a second time if I want to do a second cycle, you know, then you're thinking, okay, going back, paying again, feeling like that again.
Yeah.
You know, but that's, you know, that's kind of what comes with deciding to do this course.
So now that you are planning for your second cycle, how do you think you will plan it differently from the first one, such that you weren't going to be as disappointed with, for example, some of the services, the flexibility that wasn't really there? How would you plan around it this time?
So I've been really heartened by a friend's experience. She went to, I think it's the London Women's Clinic, and it's just geared up towards young women coming in, those similar sets of considerations. And there's just a bit more structure around the guidance of going in and out. And I think that's quite important. I think some of the people that I've known who've had the best experiences have had an older sister that's done it and they've gone to that doctor, or you know, they've got a friend who's gone through and you know, it comes as a referral. And I think I would probably now go and choose one of those clinics. The price difference was within, I think, a margin of about 10%.
Yeah.
The UK is fairly regulated in terms of the costs. And I think that extra access, some of the pre-briefing, some of the, you know, the setup for virtual calls and stuff. Although, you know, virtual calls was very doable at the clinic I went to. You know, I think that I'd probably find that infrastructure a bit more convenient. But yeah, I'd probably do the UK again.
Yeah. When you talk about sort of picking hospitals or clinics, and I think one thing that people sometimes look at when they think about choosing a place overseas is the success rates, right? So especially when it comes to the IVF piece. So one thing I do caution sometimes is to look at how these statistics and data are reported, because even and how they're represented, right? Because sometimes it may look like their success rates are quite good, but you need to figure out whether that's specifically talking about pregnancy rates or is it talking about birth rates, right? How are the clinics or the hospitals in terms of what are their crowds of patients usually? Are they usually younger women with milder fertility issues, or are they treating more older patients who tend to have more struggles and challenges, right? And so that really makes a difference in the numbers. So we shouldn't just be looking at just pure success rate.
Completely, and it's important to have that chat with the consultant that you're speaking to as well, for exactly those reasons. So, you know, particularly the clinical practice that he ran, I was definitely one of the younger patients that he was seeing, and a lot of people it is because of difficulties with you know, with natural conception and then choosing that route, and a lot of it was IVF. It's different, you know, as you say, there's different specialisms and there's different metrics, and also you know, it's an industry or you know, a sector that's very, very fast evolving, and the people who are choosing what they call lifestyle or, you know, kind of elective courses of treatment, it's a pretty new phenomenon, and also, you know, success rates are really dramatically improving. So often when you're looking at these numbers, you're looking at you know, fairly historical data of long trials, and also in the UK, I think people have to, or, you know, the clinics have to file within a couple of years. So it's not necessarily that, you know, it's that immediate term anyway. But I think having had a look on that website, you can see that they have a you know, they have certain margins of what's considered normal, and they do certain breakdowns, but really there's, you know, you're not going to become an overnight expert in it, so you really are reliant on you know, trust in the system to a certain extent. You know, there's very reputable clinics, and then it's, you know, a large part down to the rapport that you've got with your consultant and making sure that you're getting the treatment that you need. And I think a lot of that comes down to asking, I know you've spoken a lot before about asking the right questions. So making sure that you utilize the appointments with lists. Definitely don't assume that you're going to remember all the questions that you want to ask when you go in. And I know that SOs listing out quite a lot of things to consider.
We do provide that for our members.
So, so that I think really, really helps. Because you just need to understand kind of, certainly, like I asked 1,000,001 questions.
Yes.
They ended up pretty much changing my first nurse appointment, because normally they give a certain explanation on day one and then they give other explanation. Like, you just want to go through it all, don't you? So I sat down and took the whole briefing on all of it.
I do think we shouldn't be making too many assumptions when it comes to picking your treatment and whatnot. So asking questions is great. One thing I really like about the UK when it comes to, if you're really thinking about a treatment overseas and where that should be, is that it is quite highly regulated. The Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority does a pretty good job in making sure that all clinics report similar statistics, right? And so the success rates have to be defined similarly across the board. And I think that is very helpful. Another thing that's going to be helpful is when you do talk to clinics overseas, definitely have to ask about how they're regulated. What is their national regulator? Are they following specific laws? What are the types of requirements they need to follow? Actually, in the EU, there are certain these types of requirements, but actually not all clinics may be required to follow them and whatnot. And so it is helpful to always ask those questions and not really make those assumptions.
Definitely.
Right?
And the paperwork, I classic. I had 3 weeks, I think, with the paperwork. And I filled it in on the morning of my nurse's appointment or consultant, whoever I was going in to see. And then, to my horror, discovered that there was about 2 hours worth of paperwork and exercises that I was meant to go through. Which is very different from my LA experience, which is very just a quick one. We just they send us the paperwork beforehand. You just need to look through, and then you just sit down with a consenter, and they just watch you do the ticks and just agree on things. Well, that's what I thought I was opening up to do, but actually the way, and it could have just been that clinic, but it's certainly what you have to complete is consistent in the UK. So the first section was walking you through the medical parts of the procedure, the risks. The reason it took so long was because as they went through the different sections of the papers, there would be short videos that would explain to you some of the risks and also how some of the different medical stages would work. So you have to then sort of click consent through those sorts of pieces, and then it takes you on to a second one, which is around the rights to the eggs that you're freezing, and so one of the things that I was asked repeatedly was about whether I was doing it for myself, was I in a relationship, also was anyone else contributing to the cost, and that was asked by the consultant, it was asked by the nurses, it was asked in the paperwork. Wow. They were very keen to make sure that I understood the implications and the ramifications of any kind of assistance or perceived sharing on those sorts of things. And then the third bit, which we've also spoken around, was in the storage and then the options afterwards as well. So I think you alluded to a couple of them are gloomy ones, like what happens if either if you don't use them, if you pass away. Also, if you have some that you don't use, then there's different options, whether it's donating to other people, whether it's donating to research. So that there was a lot to take account of. But actually it was very transparently managed. So
that's great to hear, because what I felt like, at least they it gave you 3 weeks ahead of time and you needed to do it. And I really highly encourage people to do that. Because my experience was that I also did it quite last minute, because I thought I just need to sit down with the consenter, and they didn't really give us the paperwork until we got to LA. And what I found was, actually, when I sat down with the consenter, I felt the pressure to continue to consent, even though I was uncomfortable with, for example, a very specific item on my treatment list. So when it comes to the fertilization piece, I've talked about in previous episode before, where I only then at the when I was consenting did I realize that I did not have the option to go for traditional IVF versus XE. Okay, and so when I was sitting there, I saw there was not an option to pick something else. I paused. I had to really gear up my courage and talk to consent and be like, why is there not another option? And she simply said to me, oh, then you need to talk to your doctor. And then we had to pause the entire thing, had to go back to the clinic, talk through, make another appointment with a doctor, understand why that was the case before I could go back to the consent. And so if I were, obviously the outcome for us didn't make a difference because the clinic that we were with did not provide a traditional IVF route. Yeah. But I felt if there was, it still took a lot of courage to pause it at that moment, and it's just a lot of pressure to feel like you have to dissent. When you're
and also because the rules are very different depending on whether you're just doing the egg freezing or on whether you're doing the embryo freezing. So I think people kind of need to sort of get into the nuance and really kind of ask. Usually there's nurses who are available at all of the clinics, so you don't have to save it all for the consultant's appointment. You can just focus on your medical treatment there, but then phone up the nurse and they'll sit down, they'll talk you through all the paperwork. You'll get the links, you can read them in your own time, hopefully.
Yeah,
or at least there's a question that you should ask maybe if you are looking at another country. But yeah, I think that was quite important, just making sure that all of those options were explained.
And ideally before you fly. I think find that out before you did, because for me, I felt I was already there. I again, we talked about there's so little room for error and wiggle room that I couldn't just pause the entire thing and decide to not to go ahead. And so when you're going through an overseas treatment, it's so important to really prepare ahead of time, consent ahead of time, hopefully. Even if that location requires you to physically consent, read all the paperwork, understand what your questions are ahead of time so that going in, you're ready to consent. Because or else once you're in the location, you're in the country, you've flown there already, there's just so much sunk cost to feel like you want to back out at that point.
And there's it does feel a bit that's ironically probably one of the reasons you're able to sort of sit there with the injection is that by that point you're so signed up that it's quite difficult to go back.
That's true. You're not going to chicken out at that point and be like, guess what, I'm not doing it anymore. But
I don't want to overkill the risks. It's pretty low risk, but at the same time it's not without risk. And so with the with the challenge, if I'd gone for a slightly higher dosage, then basically that increases your risk of deep vein thrombosis. So then they recommend that you don't fly for longer. So again, it's a managed risk. But when you're thinking about whether it's the difference between I need to go for 3.5 weeks or I need to go for 5 weeks.
And that's a lot of time
post-COVID. That's quite a big chat with work, isn't it? So
I thought actually COVID was the perfect time for fertility treatments. You can be discreet about it. You can really lay low and work from home. You just need to put a Zoom screen of it. Even at the clinic, people thought it was some blue screen thing you selected for that week, right? So I thought that was pretty good.
That was well timed. I think it's kind of getting more normalized, I think. But it's also like you don't necessarily want to tell work what you're doing. So
unless they're paying for it, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, even then, actually, it's I guess HR knows, but you don't. Whether you want to talk to your manager about it is up to your discretion.
And I think that's it. Everyone's circumstances can be very different on that. And I was talking to another friend who was looking at London as well, and she was having to pay for accommodation. So then it's not just the actual procedure. You've also got to be factoring in however many weeks you're going to be there. So it's a big undertaking. So so it is challenging. There are pressures, and then there's a lot of pressure for it to go right. And I think that's probably the hardest piece of the whole thing is, I think there's a lot of different discussions around, 20, is this magic number, but, even as you're going through it, you will be getting updates from the medical professionals about how many follicles you're showing. Then they will make the decision to, decide trigger injection and book in the retrieval. And that number of follicles isn't necessarily what you're going to actually get at the end.
Oh, I learned the hard way for this.
Yeah. And so my follicle number versus the number that were successfully retrieved was half.
I was about 60%.
Yeah, and so I kind of got that call while I was in a coffee shop halfway down the road, and just very caught off guard. Not that it was a huge shock. I mean, I was slightly disappointed with the number, but it was explained well to me by the consultant that it varies so much, and it's not even just person to person. And we're looking at these big statistical numbers, but you could do exactly the same thing next month, and your body could just produce a different number, or this could happen. So I think we put so much pressure on needing that number from that cycle, and unfortunately they do say that you're probably going to need 2 to 3 cycles, and that it is a kind of some people I'm sure are very lucky, and I have heard examples of people getting a good number in their first round. For a lot of people, they do have to go back multiple times, and that's quite a difficult thing. And I think just for any listeners who are sort of thinking about what that number is, because I nearly had a meltdown, just trying to get from the consultant an answer of what is good.
You're backing them into a corner, and they would not tell you, basically.
I totally, it's averages and there's no perfect number. Yes, I get it. But
what is your best prediction?
What have I signed up for? This is meant to be anyway. So what I found really helpful that was explained to me was that in an IVF cycle, you're looking for 1 to 2 healthy eggs to be injected that hopefully they take. I'm not very scientific. You mean? Yes. Embryos. Terrible. I've really not nailed the science. But anyway, so you're looking for 1 to 2 that eventually kind of go into that IVF cycle. But if you think about, those eggs that you have that are collected, they've got to be frozen, and then they've got to be thawed, and then you've got to go through the fertilization process, and then you've got to successfully implant them, and there might be some along the way that aren't healthy or that don't thaw well. So that's the number that you're kind of that's where you then kind of get up to this 20 point. And then it's how many rounds would you sort of need to go through. So those are the sorts of numbers that you're dealing with, but it's quite difficult to find someone who will sit down and just explain it to you in layman's terms. I think that was what I found the most the hardest of a lot of it was there is so much nuance to it, but at the same time you're just trying to find someone who can speak like a human and explain what it is in really dumb terms, to somebody that doesn't really understand the difference between egg and follicle, and I think that's why I came unstuck with a lot of that language as well. I thought when we were talking about follicles that we were talking about numbers that would be retrieved, and there was just a lot of I just didn't really understand the subject matter very well. So you are very reliant on other people for that.
So one thing we really encourage our members to do is always to ask questions, and there's no dumb questions. Ask until you're completely clear about what your process looks like. I mean, you pay so much for it, they might as well really sit you down and talk through it. But one of the challenges is that sometimes you just don't know what you don't know, and that's where the knowledge gap is. And something that we're trying to do at Soul Fertility is to run these podcasts host workshops, right? Have online resources to really educate women who need this information to be better able to advocate for themselves in the clinic, in the room. They feel equipped to actually ask those questions for themselves, because I'm not going to be sitting in the room with them. Nobody else can ask those questions except for yourself, for you. So I think that's highly important, that similar to other actually medical treatments and whatnot, that we need to be advocating for ourselves and asking the right questions.
Yeah. And we're learning so much. I mean, even we've had numerous discussions on this, but it's funny, once you suddenly start talking about a subject, then people come out the woodwork and other people are looking at it, or somebody's done it. And every single conversation you're learning more and more, or, they were
and
allowed
hopefully
to change their
research that's doing more research as well.
Completely,
I think one thing that, we mentioned, what is sometimes a bit disheartening is to hear that, they don't really have answers. A lot of doctors even don't have answers to why, there's these nuances and differences in terms of how the follicle is growing and whatnot. And it's because we're still not doing enough research in women's health, right? We're still needing to invest so much more in women's health and infertility. And I'm hopeful that we're doing a lot more of that, given the push now in the industry and addressing, hopefully, that women's health gap. But at the same time, in the meantime, what we could do is at least find the best information that is available.
And you're doing that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I think on the topic of really picking your overseas treatment or clinic and whatnot, I think one thing we really talked about was, the jurisdiction, the legal restrictions, really understanding the laws and regulations when it comes to the location you're picking. I think another thing that's related to that is also asking your clinic about their history, medical history, and also the risk that they see. Also, their how they view multiple gestation. What that means is that a lot of times when it comes to embryo transfer, one of the biggest risks for the mother and the baby is actually having twin and triplet pregnancies in the IVF process, right? And so what is the general policy around that? What's the take of doctors about it is also important. I think that's one big piece. The second piece I think we talked about is the logistics. Thinking about that ahead of time, whether that's planning your schedule, your accommodation, your travel, those are all really important, and the consent forms, really thinking ahead.
And giving yourself headspace for it as well. I think one of the things that I found was I think you were the same. It was so focused on logistics and dates and where I needed to be and time, or like it was like I just remember when she sat down and she showed the the example of the taking the injection. I burst into it. So it was like completely inconsolable because I hadn't really thought through the actual medication bit because I've just been busy with the other stuff. It does take quite a lot. Like it's not, it's not, I wouldn't sugarcoat. Like it's fine. Like it's an injection every sort of day. You feel a bit rough. It's not ideal. It's less than 2 weeks. But at the same time, do give yourself the space to do it as well. You're spending thousands of dollars. You're investing all of this time. You just need to be healthy and you need to be focused on it.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
I would encourage, I know it's not possible for everybody in every situation, but I'd just encourage people to try and take that time for yourself so that you're focused on it and that, it is worthwhile, that time that you're investing in going to do it.
And also to avoid disappointment also around the finance and the billing. I think it's really important to look at the numbers ahead of time and figure out whether there's any unexpected surprises and hidden cost, right? And so because sometimes we do hear a lot and say, hey, this overseas clinic and treatment seems to be a lot cheaper, right? But does it already include the fertility drugs? Does it include the doctor consultation fee? What's that including? Like definitely have to remember to compare the whole package cost, adding on top your accommodation, your travel expenses, and the food cost.
And freezing.
So you've
right? Got the annual cost as well.
Exactly. So I think sometimes people see these ads, the Instagram ads are popping up in other locations, say, hey, this is the price. I really do caution and say, hey, think about this in a total picture where the numbers all add up. It may not be as much cheaper as you thought. And again, it comes back to the expectation management. You'll hate to see at the end when the bills comes through and you're like, oh, actually I went through all the hurdle, went to somewhere else to do it, and then actually I'm not really saving that much.
But also, you know, there's the short-term cost, there's the immediate piece that you're doing now. There's also the cost associated with the IVF when you know, decide to do that. So unfortunately it's not just, you know, the one-off, or, you know, in this case 2 rounds plus storage. You know, it will be whatever it requires later as well.
And if you talk about having donor eggs or sperm, then you think about another layer of sort of how do you deal with donor information and anonymity, how do you deal with selecting your donor, recruitment and health checks and all these things, and the legality of this is at a whole different ball game, right? So
and I don't want to sort of scare people and put them off. You know, I think like it's, you know, one bite at a time to a certain extent.
That's true.
But it's a big undertaking, and it's a really fast evolving space. And you know, I think we're all watching the headlines coming out of the US at the moment, and all of a sudden, you know, fertility rights is something, and reproductive rights is something that's now
debatable.
All of a sudden, you know, we you know, that's under threat, and so that's important for us to, you know, to both sort of stand up in terms of protecting those rights, but also just make sure that these conversations are freely had, and making sure that, you know, we are advocating for these causes that we feel really passionately about, because, you know, unfortunately it looks like one of these key markets that, you know, people are going and utilizing these options and these treatments, and, you know, unfortunately the picture isn't as sound as it looked 1 to 2 years ago. So I think, you know, we need to you know, we need to advocate for the rights that we want, and just go into it eyes wide open on those 3 pieces. So the medical piece, that's, you know, the treatment that's right for you in an institution that suits you and your needs, but also in a jurisdiction that you can see yourself going to in 3, 5, 7, 10 years time, and making sure that that's a decision that's going to be good for you, and that's going to support, you know, what you hope to get out of the process. One
thing I really like about the evolving legal progress in the UK around the fertility space is the fact that they have now changed the law to increase the number of maximum storage years for eggs, sperm and embryos. So before 2022 July, the maximum amount of time you can store is 10 years, unless you have premature infertility or going to have fertility, going to have medical treatments that are going to impact your fertility, right? Then you can do a maximum 55 years. Now, basically after July 2022, you can store your eggs, sperm and embryos up to 55 years. Obviously, it's renewal by every 10 years, but that's great news, especially for people who are doing it for, like you said, lifestyle or elective reasons, because they tend to do it earlier, and this is makes it super helpful for them to consider the options more down the road.
Definitely. No, I couldn't agree more.
Thank you for watching today. If you like our content, do remember to like and subscribe to our channel. See you next time. Bye. Thank you for tuning in today. Subscribe to our channel wherever you are so you will never miss our episodes when they drop. Be sure to share our podcast with your friends so that we can break the taboo on fertility together. Don't forget to follow us on our social media channels to stay up to date on the latest moves of So Fertility and get tips in navigating your fertility journey. I am Dawn Chan, and we will see you next time at How Would You Like Your Eggs podcast.